Thank you all so much for spending part of your afternoon or evening, depending on where you are with us today, to hear some data and some analysis about the upcoming Georgia runoffs that are happening on December 6th. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And boy, are we excited to talk to you about Georgia and the challenges and the opportunities that we see there. So let's go ahead and get started. This is what the next 55 minutes are going to be like. I'm going to start with a very quick, I'm talking like 3-minute introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. This is not a learn about the Environmental Voter Project session. This is a session for people who already know about EVP and want to hear about Georgia. And then we're going to jump into why there's a runoff, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, how we at the Environmental Voter Project are going to succeed, and then we will have a Q&A session. Again, for those of you who have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We will not be answering them as we go along, but Perry Mazzotta, who many of you might know from running phone banks, is going to lob questions to me in the Q&A, depending on how many he sees in there. So let's go ahead and get started. Very briefly, for those of you who are new to the Environmental Voter Project, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just two things. One, we identify environmentalists who don't vote. And then two, we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think about us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. We find dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who aren't voting, and then we make a purely behavioral intervention to turn them into better voters. And it's a very clear 3-step process. The first is we use data science to individually identify. So we're not going after broad demographic groups. We are individually identifying people on voter files who have a really high likelihood. We're talking like a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate change, but literally listing it as their #1 priority. And again, this isn't an introduction seminar, so I don't have time to go into how we build these predictive models. There's plenty of information on our website at environmentalvoter.org if you're interested in that. But suffice to say, what this first step allows us to do is have a list of these super environmentalists who we know also are unlikely to vote based off their previous voting histories. And once we have them, we can move to step number 2, which is mobilization. Because once we have this group of people who we know, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, well, that frees us up to be completely agnostic with our messaging. Then all we care about is getting them to vote. We don't need to educate them about any issues. We don't need to try to convince them to care about this thing that's already their #1 priority. No, we can just leverage the latest behavioral science and run dozens of randomized control trials each year just to figure out which message, even if it doesn't talk about climate change, even if it's a message based around chocolate chip cookies, if it's a message that our experiments show us turn these non-voting environmentalists into better voters, you better believe we're going to deliver that and double down on it. And we work with thousands of volunteers, many of whom are on this call, canvassing, calling, sending postcards to these voters, all with this behavioral science-informed messaging. And then we, without volunteers, also do direct mail and digital ads. And then the final third of the 3 steps is habit reinforcement. As smart as we hope we are with all of this data science and behavioral science, the truth is our stubbornness is what gets us 90% of the way there. We recognize at the Environmental Voter Project that it's really hard to turn non-voters into habitual voters if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. Surprise, surprise, that is not how you change habits. The way you change habits is by viewing every single election, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly inconsequential or divorced from environmental policymaking. You need to treat every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. Just like if you were trying to lose weight, you wouldn't go to the gym once every 2 years. You'd go every chance you get. Well, at the Environmental Voter Project, we believe in habit reinforcement, and we never let an election pass us by in the states that we work in without using it as a way to get at these low propensity environmental voters and turn them into better voters. All right, that's who we are at the Environmental Voter Project. And because of this year-round work, we get some great results. In individual elections, sometimes we boost turnout as much as 4 percentage points over our control groups, which is a really big number. That's in local elections. In bigger state and federal elections, it's more like 1 or 2%. Again, really big numbers. But perhaps what we're most proud of is what you see here, is our long-term impact. We're now working in 17 states. These light green states we just expanded into last year, so we don't have long-term data there yet. But in the other 12 darker green states, we have spoken to 8.7 million unique individual voters since launching 6 years ago. And by definition, if the Environmental Voter Project is talking to you, you were unlikely to vote in an election. And by the end of last year, 1,030,000 of those 8.7 million low propensity environmental voters had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. That is what we are most proud of. Because ultimately, nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And if you flood the zone with more and more environment first voters in every election, politicians are going to follow because they love to win and they hate to lose. So that is who we are at the Environmental Voter Project. Forgive me for those of you who are new to us and want to learn more. That's not what this seminar is about. This is a special briefing on Georgia. But as we head into Georgia on the next bunch of slides, I do just want to say, you see this number down here? Going into 2022, there were 46,478 super environmentalists in Georgia, who again, by definition, we were only talking to them because they kind of sucked at voting. And walking into this year, we had helped turn 46,478 of them into such consistent super voters that they're going to show up for a dog catcher election. That type of long-term growth is where real political power comes. All right. That being said, let's talk about the short term. And I mean the really short term, because in 26 days, there's a US Senate runoff election. So December 6th, that's the date we're circling on our calendars. And this is what got us there. As I think many of you know, there was a US Senate race. The incumbent Democrat, Raphael Warnock, did not get 50% plus one of the vote. In Georgia, that means you go to a runoff. You might remember the runoff that happened in 2020 and then went through to January 5th in 2021. That lasted 9 weeks. This one ain't going to last 9 weeks. This one lasts 4 weeks, now only 26 days. Before we get into most of what we're going to talk about today, which is turnout, I do just want to talk a little bit more about some of the votes in this general election that just happened. There was a gubernatorial election in Georgia, Brian Kemp versus Stacey Abrams, that happened at the exact same time. It was on the exact same ballot for everybody who went there. And I think like the ghost in the room of this upcoming runoff is Brian Kemp. This is not just about Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, because when Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker just went to this super close election that you see right here, at the same time, Brian Kemp was beating Stacey Abrams by 300,000 votes. He won with a 7.6% margin. And what this kind of confusing looking, but I think ultimately you'll discover kind of interesting chart shows, is the shift that happened when comparing these two races back to the 2020 presidential election. So if you think about the Joe Biden-Donald Trump election, at least in Georgia in 2020, that's our baseline. Using that as a baseline, look, in the gubernatorial election, if you look at the ballots cast, they all shifted red, except for a teeny little bit south of Atlanta there. They all shifted pretty dramatically red. Brian Kemp dramatically outperformed Donald Trump in Georgia. It was more of a mixed bag in the Senate race. You see in the population centers all around Atlanta, this is where most of the people are, Raphael Warnock outperformed Joe Biden. Elsewhere, Herschel Walker outperformed Donald Trump. I wish I could tell you I know exactly what this portends. I don't, but I know that it's going to be a factor. One compelling storyline from this could be, wow, Brian Kemp sure dragged a lot of voters out for Herschel Walker. And with Brian Kemp not on the ballot in this runoff, I wonder if that's going to hurt Herschel Walker. That's a legitimate way to describe what might happen with Brian Kemp no longer being on the ballot. Another way to look at it is, and the data shows this is also legitimate, there are a whole lot of people who voted for Brian Kemp and voted for Raphael Warnock. They were ticket splitters. And if Brian Kemp's not on the ballot, those are votes that Raphael Warnock might not get anymore. Those people might just stay home. This is a big factor that I think is going to really confuse people for a while. And again, I don't pretend like I have an answer as to what's going to happen, but I think it's an important factor. It's also the reason why a few hours ago, Mitch McConnell got on the phone and asked Brian Kemp, like, can Republicans borrow your turnout machine? Now, maybe Mitch McConnell's wrong. Maybe there is no turnout machine, but clearly this is something that people are talking about and thinking about. All right. When we look ahead, focused on turnout, because that's what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, the biggest challenge that we see in this upcoming runoff election is what's going to happen to early voting. This is the story, folks, early voting. So in the general election that we just had, just like in all recent elections in Georgia, a ton of people voted early. So in our voter files, we saw that 30% of all registered voters, so that's the denominator we're talking about, not ballots cast, but 30% of every single registered voter in Georgia voted early in this election. That's a lot. That's a lot. Moreover, the environmentalists we've identified at the Environmental Voter Project, so this isn't the low propensity ones, we're going to get to that in a second, but this is just all the environment first voters we've identified at the Environmental Voter Project in Georgia. Well, holy moly, look at that. Over half of them, over half of the registered environment first Georgians didn't just vote, they voted early. Now, that's not unusual. As I think many of you know, early voting and voting by mail has become increasingly partisan, just like everything in this life. And obviously, environment first voters tend to be more progressive. And so you would expect people who care deeply about the environment to outperform the overall electorate when it comes to early voting. But I still put this here because it highlights how crucial early voting is for the environmental movement as well as for the broader progressive movement. Finally, just looking at EVP's targets. So these low propensity environmental voters, these are registered super environmentalists who have either never voted in a midterm or they haven't voted in a midterm for like 12 years. So we looked at them and we said, okay, we should still consider them as being unlikely to show up. They need this behavioral intervention of ours. Even 17.6% of them voted early heading into this general election. And again, I'm not saying this to like pat ourselves on the back. We'll have plenty of data about how well EVP did or how poorly we did in a few months when full voter files are uploaded and updated. No, the reason I put this here is to highlight the importance of early voting, which is going to change dramatically now that we're having this runoff. What you see here is a whole bunch of variables that lead into the importance of early voting in Georgia and how they will be different compared to the last US Senate runoffs that we had, the one where both Ossoff and Warnock won on January 5th, 2021. That runoff, that was 63 days long. This one, 28 days. They changed the laws in Georgia and now have federal races have the same runoff duration as state runoffs. And of course, 2 days have passed. So now we're just talking about 26 days. All right. Well, just because the actual campaign is shorter, that doesn't necessarily mean that early voting needs to be shorter, but it is. There were 22 days of early voting in those previous US Senate runoffs. In this one, the new law states, and there's been some confusion about this. You might see a lot of reporting saying that early voting is going to start in Georgia on Monday. That is not true. It's not true. I wish it were true, but it isn't. No, the law says early voting must start as soon as possible, but no later than a week before the runoff. We've been calling around not just to the Secretary of State's office, but to a whole lot of county elections offices. They understand that November 28th is when early voting has to begin, but that they can begin a little bit earlier. And there are a few counties who think that they might be able to start early voting November 26th or 27th. But that's not going to be clear until we get really close to there. They've got to certify the election and then they've got to print ballots. Like they can't just start early voting if they haven't certified the election and have a whole bunch of ballots there for people to fill out. Then when is early voting going to end? Well, Georgia is one of those states where they don't just let you early vote all the way up until Election Day. No, in this instance, it ends the Friday before Election Day. Now, in the last set of runoffs, it actually ended the Thursday before because of January 1st being a holiday and all that. But what this all leads to is, instead of having 17 days of early voting, we're going to have probably 5, maybe in some counties, 6 or 7 days of early voting. That's a big deal. That's a big deal for a movement that depends on early voting for turnout. And when I say movement, I don't just mean the environmental movement, I mean the broader progressive movement. Moreover, there won't be any time to register new voters because the law is you can register for an upcoming election in Georgia up to 30 days before Election Day. Well, if you've got a 28-day runoff, that's fewer than 30 days, so no one can register for this. And so what this means is when we think about what turnout might be for this race, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have moved ahead. It is most likely not going to be a huge number of ballots that were cast like in the last runoff. What you see at the bottom there, that's not total ballots cast in the last runoff. That's how many early vote ballots were cast, a little bit more than 3.1 million. That was 70% of all ballots cast. Think about that. That huge set of runoffs. The entire world turned its eyes to Georgia for those 2 US Senate runoff elections. 70% of those ballots were cast during early voting. Not going to happen this time. And one other thing. The Environmental Voter Project did some polling back in July, and we were asking a whole bunch of questions to inform some of our messaging and the behavioral science we use, but we also wanted to figure out what voters' perceptions were of voting logistics and how complicated they thought voting was. And some people might look at this and say, oh gosh, people think it's kind of easy to vote. No, I look at this and I say, all of these bars should be green. I mean, first of all, this is only a poll of registered voters. So we're only polling already registered voters, which is good because that's the only people who can play in this upcoming runoff. Almost 30% of already registered Black voters in Georgia either think it is very complicated to vote or fairly complicated to vote. That is another form of voter suppression. I mean, if you simply psych people out of the game before they even try to vote because they think it's so complicated, that's a problem. And we were doing this poll back in July before we knew that any of this crazy stuff was going to happen, where we're going to take 17 days of early voting and telescope it down to 5 days, and you wouldn't be able to register and you wouldn't do that. I mean, this is what we're going to be dealing with. But what all of this means is that turnout will be at a premium. Typically, when you're heading into an election, you kind of think of it as like a three-legged stool where you've got persuasion, turnout, and voter registration. Well, voter registration is off the table. No one more can register. Persuasion, I'm not pretending that persuasion won't be important. It's always important to change people's minds and make them feel bad about your opponent and wonderful about your candidate. But these folks are pretty known entities. We just had a really big, expensive campaign about them. The big change is going to be all of these Georgians who love to vote early ain't going to be able to do it as easily. That is the big thing here, and that's why turnout is going to be at a premium. And so when we think about what turnout might be, and we look at previous generals followed by runoffs, well, the 2018 one, you can see about 3.9 million people voted. This was the first Stacey Abrams, Brian Kemp gubernatorial election. That did not go to a runoff. The Secretary of State race went to a runoff. And of course, there was an enormous drop-off because, sorry, Secretary of State, but you're not as interesting usually to voters as gubernatorial elections are. In those US Senate runoffs that we had, you can see almost 5 million people voted. And then turnout dropped down to 4.5 million. But again, that was a 9-week runoff. Ballots are still being counted in the election we just had. It's a little bit north of 3.9 million. If we had a 9-week runoff, I would tell you, gosh, maybe turnout for the runoff is going to be even higher than the general because so much money is going to be spent. And maybe the entire US Senate will hinge on it again. This is going to be a big deal. Maybe turnout is going to approach this number rather than what was in the general. But now I'm thinking, and I borrowed a lot of other big brains, much bigger than mine, to ask them if they thought I was crazy. And people think that turnout is going to be lower, and in large part because of this really, really shortened early voting window. Is 3.4 million the right number? I don't know. It could be significantly less. I don't know. All right. So this is why boosting voter turnout will be everything in this runoff. We've got 26 days, and instead of 17, 18 days of early voting, we have probably 5, maybe 6 or 7 in some counties. But there are some opportunities. When we look at our targets, the Environmental Voter Project's targets in Georgia, these are super environmentalists who are registered to vote, yet they have either never voted in a midterm or haven't done so in a while. So we view them as being unlikely to vote, and they need that behavioral intervention of ours that has yielded us so many votes over the last few years. This is what we see. We have 136,799 targets. What does that mean in a state like Georgia? Well, there are 7.8 million registered voters. As I just told you, maybe 3.4 million ballots are going to be cast in this upcoming runoff. And so this target population that we have at the Environmental Voter Project, it is large enough that it is equal in size to 4% of all people who we think are going to cast ballots 26 days from now. And so, yes, it can obviously be a difference maker. It can obviously be a difference maker. It is also, as you can see here, very geographically concentrated, which certainly makes it easier for us to canvass, do door-to-door canvassing efficiently. Although I'm not going to pretend like that's going to be easy in a 26-day runoff. A little bit of demographic information about who our target voters are. You can see two lines down here. The bottom line are demographic breakdowns of all registered voters in Georgia. The line right above it are our environmental voter project targets. But just not to confuse you, they are also registered to vote. So the EVP targets are a subset of that larger group on the bottom. First thing, as probably comes to no surprise, as many of you, our target population is disproportionately young. So 77% of them are 34 or younger. We see that in all of our states. There's a gender gap. Women are more likely to care deeply about environmental issues than men are. But truth be told, this is actually a smaller gender gap than we see in pretty much every other state. Usually, if the overall electorate breaks 47-53 in a state, our EVP targets will be more like 40-60, with 60% being women, 40% being men. Here, the gender gap is slightly smaller. Also, like in most states, our target population is disproportionately made up of people of color. As you can see, it's pretty much 50% white, 50% people of color with our target population. Oddly, though, unlike some of our other states, that's not coming from Black Georgians. It's coming, in all of our states, it comes largely from Hispanic and Asian Americans, but we don't see a significant drop-off among Black voters like this as we do in other states. But the big bump among Hispanic, AAPI, and Native American voters, we do see pretty consistently. And just because I stumble even when the words are coming out of my mouth, I feel like I have to just say a caveat here. The reason we use a lot of somewhat antiquated demographic nomenclature here is because this is the terminology used in voter files. And it really isn't analogous to, Black and African American aren't really analogous. Latinx and Hispanic aren't really analogous. Asian and AAPI aren't really analogous. And so that's why we sometimes use antiquated language when we're using voter file data. Just wanted to get that out there. All right, so this is our target population there. We obviously can't reach all of them with all of our interventions, but about 65% of them are canvassable. What does that mean? It means they don't live in gated communities, or they don't live on the 11th, floor of a high rise, or they have other targets of ours who live near them, right? Like, even if you don't live in a gated community and you're in a single family home, if your closest neighbor is 20 miles from you, we're not going to send a canvasser to your door. But 65% of our targets are canvassable and in dense areas, which is great. We have confirmed landline or cell phone numbers for 73% of our targets. We have confirmed deliverability for direct mail to 88%, and we have digitally matched online 78% of our targets so that we can deliver them digital ads. Why is this stuff important? Well, it's important because these are the built-in advantages that we are bringing to this enormously quick, 26-day campaign. Not to be creepy, but we literally know our 137,000 targets by name and street address. We are not targeting by demographic group here. We are targeting Mary Ann Smith at 123 Main Street because we know she doesn't vote in midterms and she cares deeply about the climate crisis. And chances are we've matched her online and can deliver digital ads and send someone to her house, and we've got her phone number too. This is a built-in advantage all the time, but especially in a 26-day election. Another built-in advantage, we have now run, I believe, over 160 randomized control trials fine-tuning our messaging so that we know which messages to deliver to which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists over which communication channels. Moreover, we have fresh, actionable data from the election that just happened. So, for instance, if we know that Marianne Smith just voted early in this general election, even though we had identified her as a low propensity environmental voter, someone who typically does not vote in midterms, we actually have specialized messaging just for people like that. It's actually a very powerful set of messaging that behavioral psychologists refer to as loss aversion. Basic idea behind loss aversion is most human beings worry about losing $5 more than they get excited by the prospect of getting $5. It's this idea that, like, we hate to lose things more than we like to get things. Well, how does that work in the voting context? If we know that one of our targets just voted, we can then message to them. And instead of making this December 6th election seem like a brand new thing that we're asking them to do, we can instead say stuff like, thank you for being a good voter in the November 8th general election. Don't ruin your good voting history on December 6th. We can flip the script and make it seem like Marianne has now been endowed with this wonderful thing, which is a brand new sterling voting record. And holy moly, Marianne, don't screw it up. Don't ruin your perfect voting record. Specialized messages like that with this fresh, actionable data that we have from the election that just happened is another built-in advantage. And then finally, our biggest one. There are many of you. I see almost 230 of you on the line here. Many of you are trained volunteers who know how to use our scripts. You just made over 1.7 million phone calls over just the past 10 weeks to our target voters, and you better believe that's a built-in advantage for this as well. So when we look at the next 26 days, we know that we have the identified targets. We know that we have years of randomized control trials that not only prove our messaging increases turnout, but we have optimized it as far as like which messages to send to which subgroups of these voters to get them to vote. And we have this, I hate to use military terminology, but I have to just describe it as like an army, like this army of trained volunteers who knows how to deploy this messaging and turn these non-voters into brand new voters. The only thing we're missing is the money. It's the money. Many of you have very, very generously funded the Environmental Voter Project. And I want you to think, what would you think of me and what would you think of the Environmental Voter Project if rather than spending all that money you donated to us, I just kind of kept it in the bank? You would think, oh, what the hell is Nathaniel doing? Like, we got to investigate these people and like never give them our money ever again. And so, no, of course I didn't do that. We just had a really big election. We spent all our money, maybe not all of it. We could still like cover payroll, but we spent it because it was a really important election. And so, no, we don't have piles of cash sitting in the corner right now, even though we have the ability to get amazing results over the next 26 days. And so what we need is not just a lot of funding, because we don't operate with an enormous cushion, because we like to turn voters, non-voters into voters, but we need it quickly, because we can't have the $415,000 that we're trying to raise all arrive one day before Election Day. That doesn't give us enough time to get this stuff in motion. In fact, this coming Monday, November 14th, because tomorrow is Veterans Day and it's a federal holiday, this coming Monday, we need to send $115,000 to our print shop to get them going on our first direct mail. We also want to buy our first tranche of digital ads. By the following week, we want to have an additional $150,000. The next week, an additional 115. Then it kind of tapers off towards the end. But yes, we need to raise $115,000 by Monday. So if any of you are wondering, oh my gosh, why was there such a quick turnaround with short notice? Didn't we just have an election 48 hours ago? Well, this is why. This is why. I knew it was a hard ask, but I also knew you didn't want me to start reporting back to you next week saying, actually, we missed our window of opportunity to have an enormous impact in this runoff. If we want to take advantage of all these enormous opportunities and overcome the enormous challenges of having a really shrunken early vote window, this is what we need to succeed. And I think, as many of you know, I'm not asking for charity. None of you give us money because you like us. We don't use the money. We spend it to try to make more votes. If this is something that is important to you, if addressing the democracy crisis is important to you, if addressing the climate crisis is important to you, and if this particular election in Georgia is important to you, we need $115,000 by Monday to give us the best opportunity to get started on this. And then we need the next 300,000 to roll in pretty quickly after that. It's just what it is. Can we spend more than that? Absolutely. But at that point, we start hitting a point of diminishing returns. And I always want to be very honest about that. Once we spend that $416,000, it's less efficient than the first $415,000. Okay, I want to leave time for Q&A. So I will just finish by saying, please donate now. Hopefully there is a donation link in the chat. You can donate through credit card there. You can also contact me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org or at info@environmentalvoter.org. And I can give you wiring instructions or stock gift instructions. If you have stock you want to give to us, we are happy to take that. And you can mail us checks as well. Moreover, I know we have many volunteers on the line. We now have phone banks for you to sign up for on the website. Now, there will be more than what you see here, but we just wanted to get started. And so you'll see, we are going to be starting a week from today, next Thursday, the 17th, with our first phone bank. We've got weekday evening phone banks. We've got weekend phone banks. But with Veterans Day tomorrow and the Thanksgiving holiday, I mean, this 26-day campaign is going to feel a lot more like a 20 or 21-day campaign. And so we've just got to schedule a whole bunch of stuff, start getting people on the phones, and kind of build this bike while we're riding it. But for those of you, and I know there are many of you on the line right now, who just lit the phone lines on fire across 15 states for the Environmental Voter Project this past fall, please go and sign up at environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. These are those two links. My hope is there will be in the chat, and we still have 20 minutes left for Q&A. Again, I want to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A because this is webinar format, because we have 210 people on the line. We can't like call on you and have you shout your question out. And I apologize for that. We all love having Zoom meetings, but for obvious reasons, this had to be a webinar. So we're going to get into the Q&A. But before we start the Q&A, I want to ask you a favor. Go into the chat, click on that URL so you have it open. The donate URL, the volunteer URL, maybe both of them, because we all know what happens with these Zoom calls, right? Once the Q&A is over, everybody drops out, and then you think like, oh my gosh, what was that URL? Where did it go? Well, that's not going to happen because you're going to click on it right now and you're going to open it up. And so you have that open in your browser when this all goes away, and you can make an extraordinarily generous donation, or you can sign up for phone banking shifts, or a little bit of both. All right, we're going to go ahead. If you have put a question in the Q&A, Perry is going to lob it to me. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. So Perry, what do we got?
Well, we do have quite a few questions, so we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but if you can kind of keep your responses as brief as possible so we can get it through as many as possible, that'd be great. And I'm just going to go kind of first in, first out. So first question, how many more volunteers do we need to make all the calls we want to make in the next 3 weeks? Or in other words, for how many hours per person do we need for a current number of volunteers to reach everyone?
Well, so that's a great question, but I wouldn't have the goal. I wouldn't describe the goal as to reach everyone. The goal is to get people to vote. And oftentimes just reaching someone once or dialing through their number once ain't enough to get them to vote. Now, we don't try to bother the you-know-what out of people, but what we would love to do is talk to people before early voting starts, get them to lock in their early voting plan or their election day voting plan. Then when the early voting period starts, call them back and say, hey, Perry, just want to remind you, a week and a half ago, you said that you were going to vote early. Early voting has just started. We see in the voter file that you haven't voted yet. Can we help you find an opportunity to follow through on your plan to vote early? See what I kind of did there? It was a little bit of like behavioral nudging. Now I'm like using the fact that you promised that you were going to do something against you and things like that. But this is how we get people to vote. Then we probably try to reach them again after early voting during GOTV if we still see you still haven't voted. So that's the goal. How many people do we need? Well, we probably are going to end up wanting to fill something like 1,300 or 1,400 shifts. How many people does that mean? Well, some people do multiple shifts. Some people only do one shift, but we're probably going to want to fill 1,400 hour-and-a-half or 2-hour phone banking shifts. That's our goal.
Great. Next one, they want to know whether we are going to get an updated voter file from the Secretary of State in Georgia.
Yes, but if you heard some hesitation in my voice, yeah, there's a lot of it. This is what we will get updates on. So the first thing is, even though Georgia has a lot of issues when it comes to making it easy for people to vote, one thing that Georgia does actually pretty darn well is turn around their voter files really quickly, because everything goes to a runoff. So they have to do it. Like they have all this practice of like turning around their voter files really quickly. So what will we get in this sort of refreshed voter file? Well, the first thing is we will have a pretty good understanding of who early voted. We might not have a good understanding of who voted on election day, but that will allow us to segment our messaging appropriately. We will probably also have a good idea of what voters should no longer be on the Georgia voter file because they truly moved. So that will probably also be incorporated in there. Moreover, and this doesn't come from the Secretary of State, this comes from the Environmental Voter Project, we will absolutely have flushed through all of the volunteer collected data that we got. So if someone picked up the phone and screamed at you and said, never call me again, well, we're not going to call that person again. That data will have been flushed through, and that person will have a do not call thing on. Now, we'll probably send them a mail piece and send them digital ads, but we won't call them again. So that's the kind of data we will have and won't have. But, you heard the hesitation in my voice. This 26-day period, I mean, as hard as it is for us, it's also really hard for all these election workers and really hard for all these people in county elections offices and in the Secretary of State's office in Georgia. Like, this is a Herculean task for them too. And so just because we have gotten stuff like this on this timeline in previous years doesn't mean I'm fully confident that we'll get it again this time around, but we hope to.
Great. I think next question. I think ranked choice voting might have been in effect for absentee voters overseas. Do you know which group of people overseas should not be contacted for the runoffs?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So there was a form of ranked choice voting that was used because Georgia anticipated the possibility of a runoff. So let me just describe what I mean by that. As I just got finished telling you, this is a really short runoff, right? 28-day runoff period. Well, they still haven't certified the results or printed ballots. And so if you are serving overseas in the military, there's no way in hell you're going to get a ballot in time to vote. And so what Georgia did was when they sent out the ballots for the general election to people overseas, they included sort of this ranked choice option that would apply if there was a runoff. And so, yes, we do have information about who had ballots mailed to them because they were overseas. Now, whether we will have information or not on whether those people returned their ballots, that's unclear. It's unclear whether we will have access to that data in the voter file with enough time to act on it. But it's a very astute question, and we will at least know which are the universe of people who likely already voted because they were already sent this stuff. What we don't know is whether we'll be able to actually isolate the ones who didn't and harangue them. But boy, is our data director, Peter, already all over county election officials asking this very question to figure it out.
Next question. Do we know if Georgia only allows people who voted in the general election to cast votes in the runoff?
So you cannot have, there will not be room for people to register again, as I mentioned before. I believe, it's a very good question. I believe the answer is you do not have to have voted in the general to vote in the runoff. This is not like a closed primary type thing where if you have a closed primary and then that closed primary goes to a runoff, you can't be like an independent who then says, okay, now I'm going to walk over to the Republican closed primary and vote in the runoff. But as you can tell from my answer, I'm not 100% certain on this. This is why I have a staff that's smarter than me. And I promise you they know the answer to this, even though I only kind of know the answer to it.
All right, keep on moving here. Next question. I was making calls the last few days. Very surprised how many wrong numbers I got. If conversations that had already been held with these EVP, I'm not, okay, I'm gonna just say word for word. If conversations that had already been held with these EVP others, how come so many wrong numbers?
Great question. So there are a few answers for that. So first of all, we have not already had conversations with these people. Oftentimes we have tried to have conversations with them. And by definition, remember, we are targeting people who are unlikely to vote, which means chances are fewer people have reached out to them than we have. So that's one thing that's just going on here. We are reaching people for whom there is less reliable data and they are contacted less often. But here's the dirty little secret. The second reason why there are so many wrong numbers is because people are lying to you. The numbers aren't wrong. They want you to go away. People just say wrong number a lot because they want you to stop calling. Now, we need to believe them. We don't want to have our volunteers keep on calling people who said that their number was wrong. But here is what we know. One, a lot of people say in polls after the fact that they tell election volunteers wrong number when it's not their wrong number. And the second thing is, and I love this, and I wish it was a statistically significant result from an experiment. It's not. It was kind of a suggested result, but there have been experiments before that have shown that if you have a huge calling campaign and the people you talk to, you increase turnout over the people in your control group. Well, some of those experiments, they've isolated the people you speak to who say wrong number. And guess what? They had elevated turnout too. So simply by calling people who then tell you wrong number, the people who you think you're calling on voter files, they have elevated turnout. Now, how would that work unless they were lying to you? If I think Marianne Smith is at 555-5555, and I call that person up and they say, no, wrong number, no Marianne Smith here, well, then why does that calling effort increase turnout of all the Marianne Smiths in the world? Now, again, I don't want to lean too much on this because it wasn't a statistically significant result. It was increased turnout, but there just weren't large enough numbers for us to be really certain of this. But there's just so much other anecdotal evidence that even calling people who then say, get off my lawn or wrong number or get lost, actually in and of itself increases turnout. Oftentimes it's more helpful to think of phone calls not as the beginning of a conversation, but more akin to direct mail. Like you're delivering a message. You're delivering a message. And if at the end of that message, someone says, screw you and hangs up, that doesn't mean you didn't deliver the message in an effective and impactful way that will increase turnout. In fact, the data suggests that that is exactly what is happening. And someone who tells you buzz off wrong number actually might be the right person. You might be increasing their turnout.
All right, a couple of questions regarding mail ballots. The first one, Georgia, early voting starts by November 28th, but people can request mail ballots now, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And then related to that, will everyone in Georgia have a ballot sent to them?
No.
Yes. Next one, I know ballot cure is happening now. Could that be enough to stop the runoff?
I have not seen any person who really understands the number of outstanding ballots and curable ballots out there think that that's a possibility. Is there probably, a 1% likelihood? Yeah. But no one thinks that's a serious possibility. Doesn't mean you shouldn't work hard to cure the ballots. You absolutely should. But I don't think it's going to stop a runoff.
Are people going to have to order an absentee ballot to vote early?
No. So I think if I'm understanding this question correctly, what the person is asking about is in some states, early voting is essentially going to a county election center, asking for an absentee ballot, filling it out, and then handing it back. And they call it, advance voting or in-person absentee voting or all these things. Or they get the ballot in the mail and then cast it. Additionally, in some states, there is not what's called no excuse early voting, but rather there is absentee voting if you have a legitimate excuse. Like in New Hampshire, you need to have a legitimate excuse that say you're going to be out of the state. Or in Texas, this isn't for absentee, but for mail ballots, like if you're over 65, you can get a ballot mailed to you, but not something else. So I think that's where this question is coming from. In Georgia, no, you do not need to have an excuse or an absentee ballot to vote early. There is in-person, no excuse necessary early voting. It's just going to be 5 days, maybe at best 6 or 7 days instead of 17 or 18 or 19.
Great. All right, next one. You are always very cagey about party distribution of environmental voters, but I suspect most of us on this call are motivated to see Warnock win. Any comments on whether we might be driving Walker voters to the polls?
In every exit poll that has come out, well, let me start at this a different way. Sorry, we're going to get into a little bit of history of exit polling here. In 2018, what had been one exit polling consortium split into 2 exit polling consortia, because 2017 was when everybody lost their mind and was convinced that polls couldn't do anything. One of those 2 exit polling consortia, so the NORC one at University of Chicago, asks a "what's your most important issue" question. And unlike the AP exit poll, they include a possible answer on climate change. So climate change is one of the options. Ever since they have done that, so they started adding climate change in 2020. So in the 2020 presidential exit poll, in the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial, and in the exit polling data from NORC right now, from the midterm general election we just had 2 days ago. In each of those 3 exit polls, people who listed climate change as their #1 priority broke harder for Democrats than any other issue constituency group in any of those 3 exit polls in any of those 3 elections. So climate first voters break harder for Democrats than pro-choice first voters, than gun control first voters. There are a whole lot of progressive issue constituency groups that you would think are, enormously reliably Democratic. Climate first voters break even harder than them.
Really
How's that
interesting.
for remaining cagey
That
while
was
still
good.
answering the question? How about that? I'll still be cagey. Yeah.
That was very good and really great data. Thank you
Yeah.
for that. Next one. You all seem so ready for this. Did you pretty much know it's coming?
I was ready for it. I mean, we knew it was a possibility. We had reached out to the union print shop we use, and I got estimates and I got a timeline. And I said, when am I going to have to wire you money to get these mail pieces ready? And I had told our digital ad company, you guys can't disappear on us because we're going to be bothering the you-know-what out of you. But does that mean that we could predict it was happening? No, we didn't have any inside information. We didn't know who was going to win or whether it was going to go to a runoff, but we certainly knew it was a strong enough possibility that we had to be ready. And many of you know our field and data director, Peter Polga-Hekimovich. He does a lot. I mean, he's kind of like the 51st Secretary of State. He just knows more about state election laws than anybody out there. And he was ready. I mean, he was just this, not only is this going to be 4 weeks versus 9 weeks, but it is going to be an insane 4 weeks. And we need to really, really quickly jump on this stuff. And so that's a long way of me saying, yes, we were ready, but no, I mean, we didn't see this coming any more or less than other smart people, like many of you probably thought it might come. All right, I think we've got time for one more question here.
Okay, how about, do you think if control of the Senate isn't a factor, will turnout be lower in this runoff?
That is absolutely a relevant question. I can't pretend I know the answer, but what I'll say is, there's kind of a hierarchy of emotions when it comes to driving turnout, right? The emotion that drives turnout most is anger. I know we don't want to admit that, but the truth is when people are really angry, they vote. They vote. Probably second in the hierarchy of emotions that drive turnout is excitement, is winning, is feeling the wind at your back. We saw that in our own environmental voter project polling data. Where before the Inflation Reduction Act, there were a whole bunch of climate first voters. I mean, a full third of them were yeah, we're not that excited to vote, which was obviously ringing alarm bells around our office. After the Inflation Reduction Act, that really, really changed. So is excitement at winning as good as being angry? No, I would still put being angry atop. The third thing is disappointment. You don't want to be disappointed. You don't want to, I mean, let's face it, there were a lot of Democrats this last spring who were just man, can't get a win. And boy, would that have been a killer for turnout. What I don't know is what are Republicans going to think heading into this if what was supposed to be a red wave turned into a pink puddle, and the control of the US Senate is not up for grabs, is that going to just make them be disappointed and stay at home? I don't know. On the other hand, if the US Senate isn't at stake, is that going to make all of these like post-Dobbs, like fearful, angry progressives who voted not see as high stakes? I don't know. I don't know. But I know you ask a really, really good question. I guess the only thing I can say with certainty is I don't think anybody knows. I think, on TV, you would never hear someone like equivocating and using all these caveats like I would. They would set the narrative and they would say, this is what's going to happen. So you're going to hear a lot of people say, this is what's going to happen. But they don't know. I don't think anybody knows whether control of the US Senate is a variable that will actually drive turnout 26 days from now. All right. We kept you 3 minutes over. Thank you all so much. I want to close just by saying you are here for a reason, not because you love Zoom. You are here because you care deeply about the political future of our country. You care deeply about addressing the climate crisis. You care deeply about addressing the democracy crisis. And you know that the Environmental Voter Project is doing extraordinary work. And so I'm just going to repeat the ask that I made before. Click on that link in the chat. Make a donation, make a generous donation. Not because we deserve it or you like us or anything, but because this is something you care about. You are here because you want to make an impact. This is your opportunity for impact. And boy, is this a really tight window. I'm gonna have to wake up on Monday, see how much money is in our bank account, and decide whether to dramatically reduce our mail plan or our digital ad plan or grow it. And we know this stuff works. So please, please, please make a generous donation. Please as well sign up to volunteer. And I will just close by saying, as many of you know, we submit all of our work to randomized control trials. We love data. We love being able to prove where we succeeded, where we didn't succeed, learn from our failures, improve on our successes. We will be reporting out to you with all of that data over the coming 2 or 3 months as voter files get updated from what just happened. And because of the hectic nature of this runoff, we didn't get the chance to relax after this huge midterm that just happened. And so let me just close by saying thank you. Thank you all so much for helping stand up one of the largest, most sophisticated get out the vote operations the country saw over the past 10 weeks. We cannot wait to thank you. We cannot wait to follow up with you and get your feedback. And more than anything, we cannot wait to report back to you on how we did and how many new voters we made together, because we really did do it together. I know that you all know that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I really look forward to seeing you all online, on the phones, on the doors, in my email over the next 26 days. Let's go do this. Bye.